to sort of, will you start off with questions? And
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'll start off with some questions. Yeah, that's fine. Morning, Charles. Morning, Podrick. Morning, Henry. Morning, Andrew. Morning, Peter. Thanks everyone for joining. Happy New Year to those that weren't on the call last week. Good to see you all. Hi, Nick. Good to see you. And
Happy New Year, Steve.
Yep. Thanks everyone for joining. Great to see you all. If you've just joined, if you could mute, please, that will just be great. Charles, if you could mute, that'd be good. Con, still, you need to sort out your name, Con, because you're still your daughter's name, but we love calling you Elspeth. It's a great name. So there we are. Right, let's mute. Okay. And then Mark, we can mute as well. That's good. Perfect. Okay. There we go. A few more people joining. Morning, Bob. Thanks for joining. Appreciate you coming on board. And and David as well. Morning, David. Thanks for joining. If you've just joined, please mute. Excellent. Okay, right. Well, welcome to this morning's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. Delighted to have Antony Manchester on from BlackRock. Some of you may know him, some of you won't know him. So the first part of this will be a brief introduction given by Antony as to what's his name and where does he come from. We mentioned a blind date earlier, so it'll be a little blind date question to Antony. But today's all really about investments and political, geopolitical views on pensions and investments and pensions policy. So I think I would be polite to call Antony a big gun in BlackRock. So, but I'll leave him to say that. As usual, we are recording. So Charles, Podrick, Con, Jim, everybody, thumbs up. We're happy to record. Perfect. I've said to Antony as well that we are a lovely bunch. Thank you, Andrew. We're a lovely bunch, and we'll ask questions as we go through. So please raise a hand, or actually, if you would like, please put a question into the chat room. So without any further ado, I'll introduce you to Antony. Antony, good morning. Thank you in advance for your time. Perhaps, oh, you're on mute. Perhaps you could just briefly introduce yourself and your career and your history, and how did you get to where you are today?
Oh well, I can do that very briefly. I'm not such a. Thank you for that great introduction. Very generous, and I'm very honoured to be invited here to speak today. It's nice to see you all, and as Steve says, we're already in the second week, but Happy New Year anyway. So I'm Antony. I'm co-head of our Europe, Middle East, and Africa government affairs and public policy function. And in particular, I sort of focus on the UK as that's the area I know best. Before joining BlackRock, I used to work in Brussels for the UK Treasury, where I headed up the team in the UK representation to the EU that used to negotiate all of our economic and financial legislation with the EU. So that was an interesting period in between the financial crisis and then what became Brexit. And before that, I had a number of jobs in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office back in London, mostly dealing with EU policy. It was really the financial crisis, though, in answer to the question of what brought me here, that sort of took me from sort of economic policy, where I used to work on competition policy, to financial services, and that was via trying to get state aid approval for a small bank called Northern Rock that the government needed to bail out back in the day, and then RBS as well, and then that sort of took me into financial stability policy, and then financial services, and eventually to BlackRock. And I'm sure you're all familiar with BlackRock. We're now we're one of the biggest asset managers in the UK. We've got we manage an awful lot of money, over $1 trillion for UK clients. 2/3 of that is pension assets, and I head up the public policy and government relations team for us. And we were set up actually at the time, as a team, we were set up at the time of the financial crisis to make sure that the investor interest was heard in some of those debates about how to treat financial services legislation and how to treat asset managers and the assets that we manage in particular. And it was hardwired into the sort of constitution, if you will, of our team's sort of articles of association, are the basis of who we are, that we work as a fiduciary. So we interact with governments all around Europe, and we have teams in the US and elsewhere as well. But we interact on behalf of you, on behalf of clients, and so we're pushing for policies that promote the best interests of the end investor and our clients, rather than us as a business. And that's a really important distinction, and I think that's something that I'm very passionate about, and it's very motivating to the team as well, because we feel that we're very much working on behalf of people. And in the UK, that's literally maybe 13 million people, we think, in total, who are saving for their retirement. So we're very much aware of the fact that we're working for and promoting the interests of ordinary people trying to save for their futures, and that's a sort of a key thing that drives us, and me and the team, as we try and influence policy. And there's an awful lot of politics in policy, particularly around pensions and savings at the moment. So it's a busy time for us, but a motivating one.
Thanks for that, Antony. Brilliant. I've got loads of questions, and probably people from the floor have got loads of questions as well. And Henry, delighted that you're on with us today, and wish you a speedy recovery. I think we've had a few Playpen sessions last year on the wonderful world of government and how government tries to influence on scheme investments, Mansion House speech and all that sort of jazz. We've got a few specialists on today as well who may have an opinion. Should we have concerns for government intervention in 2026? What are you hearing and seeing, Antony, for how government can influence how pension schemes invest?
I think, yeah, we should have concerns. It's the kind of thing that keeps me a bit awake at night, and the team. You've had a long, as you guys are all know, we've had a long period of government, in both the Conservatives and now Labour, talking about where pension schemes invest. And to my mind, this sort of really began in 2022 with the disastrous mini budget, because that really put a focus on the fact that so many DB schemes were invested in LDI, and LDI became the news story of that crisis, and it brought into sort of sharp relief the extent to which the pension system is invested in bonds rather than equities, and in particular the UK stock market and UK equities. And as the government, as the economy floundered a little bit in those years and since, we detected a period where pension schemes were being painted as the bad guys, and the emphasis was, why aren't pension schemes investing in the UK and investing in the stock market? And I think to some extent this was fanned by other parts of the financial system whose interests it was for, to try and encourage schemes to invest into the UK. And so we saw the development of the Mansion House Compact. I can't remember if it was the Compact at first or the Accord, but there was the Mansion House Compact, or the first version of that. Then there were the threats to sort of mandate pensions investment into the UK. More recently, there's talk about making the tax incentives to invest in a pension dependent on being invested in the UK, and Mel Stride of the Conservatives is talking very much about that. The government has a reserve power in the pensions bill to direct investment into the UK that could take effect after about 4 years now in 2030. And even though I think we as an industry, and I think that's the asset owner industry and the asset management industry, have been successful in pushing back on that mandation element for the last several years. It's still sort of hanging over us a little bit like a sword of Damocles, if you will. And in fact, that's the stated intention in many ways of what the pensions bill is designed to do. To try and force investment, and I do think that is worrying. And I mean, we'll talk about sort of political developments later, but it just means that pensions and pensions policy is not very far from the line of sight of politicians who are looking for quick wins or easy solutions to difficult questions about how to boost the economy. And I think it is something that we should continue to worry about.
Okay, thanks for that. Podreg, you got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question or make a challenge? Oh, can't hear you, Podreg. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, Antony, just extending that, what concerns have you got about the interference of government within the operational aspects of private sector companies, like we're seeing in the US and perhaps we might see in other countries, not just in the way they want to try and shape investment strategy on the part of private and public sector funds, but their dalliance within the private sector?
Do you mean some of the things that Trump has been saying recently in terms of, I mean,
the golden shares and the influence they're trying to exert now by committing investment into Venezuela, which hadn't been discussed with the oil companies, just for a start, and the kind of support he's trying to garner for the midterm elections to shore up his political stances.
Yeah, I think there's I'm just pulling up because I was on a call last week with one of our consultancies, and they went through the sort of 10 risks that geopolitical risks that they thought were going to influence events this year. And number 6 was state capitalism with American characteristics. And I think maybe that's what you're talking about, the sort of the fact that we've got potentially, or they thought, the most economically interventionist American administration since the New Deal, sort of picking winners and trying to direct investments, and you've seen it happen in a number of ways. There's the direct investment, say for example, into Intel that the Trump administration has made. There are executive orders that are trying to influence what companies do, particularly you will have seen recently on credit cards and in terms of price capping, which is very, very interventionist. And then also we've seen some interventions on stewardship, which is where it's sort of impacted us most of all, where in the US and for the assets of US clients, they've made clear that the stewardship should be done for purely pecuniary financial interests rather than a non-pecuniary interests. Other jurisdictions like the UK have stewardship codes and other things that we adhere to here and things. And I do think it's part of a you in many ways you could draw a line between what's going on in the UK in terms of we just talked about investment pressure, trying to direct investment. In the US you're seeing this intervention. In Europe as well, there's a sort of a desire to decouple the economy from an over-reliance on the US, and so those interferences, and we're seeing sort of a return of this sort of state intervention in many ways, and it is going to impact us in a number of different ways. It's something that I think we will continue to resist, because we as a firm are a fiduciary. So we'll always, defend our right to, we call it defending the right to steward in the UK, and we call it sort of defending our right to define the fiduciary interests in the US in terms of acting where our clients want us to behave, and where governments do. Of course, all companies have to adhere to the law, and we've done that, but it will be interesting to see what pushback there is, and how far that they can go with that. I mean, you mentioned, for instance, the Venezuela point, where the administration's talked about getting American companies to invest in Venezuela, and I think a number of them came back this week and said, well, look, it's not investable, so we can't, and we won't. And I think at the end of the day, there are clear legal restraints that can, or constraints that can, that can, to put guardrails in the extent to which you can intervene. But we're always open, and at risk of that kind of intervention anywhere, just as we are in the UK, and it's something we need to be increasingly wary of. But it is a fact, I think, that we're maybe entering a sort of a new era. I mean, the BlackRock Investment Institute talks about mega trends that are going on in the world, and has identified things like the transition and energy. We talk about we talked about the sort of rewiring of globalization, where there'll be less interdependence amongst countries, which is something that countries have wanted to do post-COVID. And I think there is less faith politically across the world in free markets, and more demand for governments to intervene to direct the economy. And at the same time, there's less resource available to governments, because they're constrained fiscally in what they can spend, and so plenty of incentive for them to turn to the private sector as well. So I think we are entering an era where all of us in the private sector are going to be under increased focus and pressure to do more for the political ends than we might have been in the previous decades. Thanks, Antony. I'm sorry, it's not a quick answer, but I mean, I really do think we're at the, I don't know. I mean, you might say that we've sort of had a period of Keynesianism after the war, and up until the sort of the late 70s, 80s, and then from then a period of much more free market and open economies, with a sort of an intense period of globalization that came after that, from the 90s into the 21st century. But really, from about now, I think a lot of people detect a change, and perhaps a new era where there will be more state intervention.
Thanks, Padraig. Are you happy with that?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting that the whole reason that Venezuela is uninvestable was due to government intervention, and the fact that I think Exxon have at least twice lost their assets to government ownership. So if we see more of this intervention, it's going to surely destabilize confidence in many markets, including not just America's, but the ones that you represent, Antony. Thank you.
No, very, very true. And and the credit cards example is another good one. I think in Europe we see a lot of political, not so much political, but certainly regulatory focus on private markets as well, and these make it more. These make the market more difficult to invest. They make it more difficult to. They make it more important to diversify. But they also make it more important to invest. I mean, we think there'll probably be a trend towards more active management strategies, because the impact of these policies is not, what's the word? It impacts different sectors to varying degrees. So you can't sort of take it's less clear that you can take we'd hate to use the phrase, I hate to use the word passive strategy, because we're very active in the investments that we manage, even though they're chosen through, and their allocation is through an index. But because you you can't be sure that the index itself won't be impacted equally by some of these political interventions, and therefore you need to have a more active strategy to be able to navigate round the sort of the rocks of this these sort of world economic waters.
Cool. Okay, Anthony. Just extending that question slightly for those, probably including me, who aren't as close to politics as we should be, on this very question, which is concerning about governments having impact on how we invest. Do we know what the Conservatives are saying, or even Reform are saying in the same space? Come 2029 or whatever it is, will there be a big shift away from this thought, or is this, this Mansion House government forcing people to invest in the UK a cross-party thing? What do you think, Anthony? Will it shift?
I think it's a cross-party thing. I've had some meetings with Mel Stride, Conservative shadow sort of chancellor, and he's been very good, but with a caveat, which is or with a twist at the end of it. And he's, as I mentioned earlier, so he's very much against this idea that pension schemes should be forced to invest where governments say they should, and he gets that, and I think he gets the intellectual argument too that a government saying, forcing people to invest isn't a good look. I mean, it's more of a sort of emerging market thing, that, it doesn't look good for the UK if it says we don't have companies that are investable and therefore we're going to force asset owners to invest in them. Where I think what's more worrying though is he is saying, but what about the tax incentive to invest that comes through with the pension? Your pension savings come out of gross salary, etc., and therefore, if the government's giving away such a tax incentive, why shouldn't we, in inverted commas, get more from it? And in many ways, that's a legitimate question, because I think the tax incentive for the pension system, for pension schemes, is huge. Could cover the cost of the NHS, and you can see why people in the Treasury or in the Conservative Party would say, well, why, what are we getting at for that? And I think the answer is, well, politicians need to sort of decide what it is they think that tax incentive is for. Is it to encourage people to save for their retirement, which I think it's for, and that's what it's intended to mean. But going forwards, or is it an element of industrial policy? Because if it's an element of industrial policy, then effectively it's a sort of a subsidy to invest in the UK by creating a disincentive, by creating an incentive for investment in the UK. And then, if you are going to treat it like that, which is what the Conservatives are talking about, then that creates a sort of worrying, that has an impact elsewhere, because effectively there probably is a cost to over concentration of investment in the UK or any one jurisdiction, and that will make itself known in terms of the retirement incomes of people in the future, which in turn becomes pressure on future generations in the exchequer, and what might be a solution for industrial policy in the short term might become a problem for retirement policy in the longer term. And I don't think that the Conservatives have necessarily sort of understood that trade-off. But to answer your question, I do think, it's very clearly up there in their sights on where you should invest. Reform are sort of coming at this from in some different ways. So I think at a kind of at a high level, they're in listening mode, and they keep setting up and asking agencies to set up round tables with investors and private sector companies. I'm sure many of you will have been invited to before, to hear what companies think and and they sort of test ideas. And I think what they're doing is very clever in that regard, because you'll have seen that Nigel Farage is rolling back from some of these statements that he'd made in the past about tax cuts or increased spending, and they've certainly got the message from whoever they've been meeting that they need to come across as more fiscally prudent, and they don't, you know, they want to, they're trying to show some degree of responsibility, and that is starting to happen, as I say, in their sort of macroeconomic fiscal policy stances. On pensions, though, and on pensions in particular, when, you know, I think the best gauge of where they're coming from is in the area where they already have some influence, and that's in local government pension schemes, because now they run a number of different LGPS, well, they run a number of different councils and therefore have a lot of influence over LGPS. And there, what they've been saying has been, I think, quite short-termist and unfortunate, in that they're talking about trying to reduce fees by trying to opt into, you know, which essentially means going to cheaper index strategies rather than what might be in the best interests of the outcome of the end of the scheme. And that, to me, doesn't sort of strike me as very, very responsible. That's more of a sort of a short term, how can we cut costs for this council that we've just got control of, so we can, you know, save a bit of money here, rather than thinking about the longer term. And so I think that's evidence of the fact that there's an awful lot of thinking that's to be done there. So I think that's worrying as well. And then sort of, I think the final point is that whoever wins in 2029 will be you know, fiscally constrained again, and there'll be pressure to spend more and cut taxes, and also to invest. And you know, I just, you know, I see it from sort of every political angle, that pressure to turn to the pension system and to private asset owners. I just think it'll be too tempting for anyone, and that's why I think it's quite worrying that you've got this clause, this sort of sword of Damocles clause in the pensions bill that says that from 2030, if I think it's you know, if there's not enough investment into the UK, then the government has a reserve power to sort of mandate and direct that. Well, Labour needs to think about who might be in charge in 2029 and how they might use that power. And I think that's a cause for concern.
Agreed. We'll come back to politics later on. My next question is about second phase of the pensions review. Let's call it Pensions Commission, I guess. I think that's the angle of the question. We have had a session last year on Pensions Commission, PC2, I think we call it, or Henry calls it PC2. What is BlackRock or Antony Manchester's view on the Pensions Commission? Is this sort of last chance saloon to get it right, or what is your impact and impression?
Are we Chatham House?
Well, we're being recorded.
Yeah. I tell you what. No, I'll be honest.
Be honest.
I'll be honest. I think they're kicking it into the long grass. All right, which is a shame. I mean, I think a pensions review is a good thing, and it's something that I've certainly been calling for a number of years. And I remember saying, I think as far back as 2019 or 2020, that we've got to go back to what happened at the start of the, in the Turner Review, and do something similar, because there's a huge problem with the savings rate in terms of how much people should save, and 8% just isn't enough. It's not going to cut it, and really, you want it to sort of be up there at 12% is what we've cautiously called for. Ideally, probably it needs to be more, and I think there's a risk for the country in whole generations of people coming online who haven't got enough retirement income to live off, or sufficient to live off, and also a lack of awareness of just how different that is. and you need a review to sort of fix that and come along and maybe make some cross-party recommendations that are therefore are going to hold, that's going to increase the savings rate. And there are many ways that you can do it. Doesn't have to be a blunt mechanism, and obviously you've got to take account of the replacement rate for people on lower incomes, etc. But I mean, a blanket 8% for everybody isn't going to cut it, and we need to address that as a country. And a commission that can do that and create the political buy-in to do that from across the spectrum is I think is necessary. The reason I say it's a bit of a kick into the long grass is it's not going to report for a couple of years. I think we're only 6 months into those 2 years, and Labour have already said it's to inform their policy after the next election, so what happens in the next parliament. And I think if you can't legislate now with a majority that you've got that's so big to try and make the fundamental changes that are necessary, how are you going to do it after the next election when presumably whoever's in power isn't going to have such a big majority? The polls are not saying it's going to be a landslide for anyone at the moment. So I think that's a missed opportunity, and I think it's drawn. It appears to be coming from a desire to avoid having to make difficult decisions now, and it's at the heart of a tension, I think, between. So I'm very frank here, but there's a tension really between what the government says it wants to do and what it thinks it needs to do to get re-elected. And at the outset, we heard a lot of talk about growth. And if you're gonna grow and then you're gonna need investment, which ideally means you want to encourage people to save more and for more of that money to go into investable, innovative companies. So that would pull in the direction of increasing the contribution rate, you'd think. And it would reduce the pressure on the state in the longer term as well. So you could start to look at affordability of things like the triple lock, which do have a drag on the UK's fiscal outlook and borrowing costs out in the longer term. So there are plenty of reasons, if you're pro-growth, why you'd want to increase the savings rate. But on the other hand, the tension comes from what we've heard a lot more about in recent months, and that's the cost of living. The government stopped talking about growth and instead is focused on the cost of living. And I think that they perceive that if there was an increase in the contribution rate, that would mean people's take-home pay was going to be that much smaller, and it would therefore exacerbate the cost of living issue, which is the short-term issue that the government seems to be focusing on rather than growth. And I think it's I think any of us from a sort of long-term public policy point of view would find that disappointing, irrespective of the commentary we have to make about the sort of the short-term necessities of that. So I think it is, I think there's a risk that it could become a missed opportunity, and therefore what BlackRock is going to be doing this year and in the years ahead is really trying to feed in ideas and thoughts into the pensions review and try and encourage a bit more ambition from ministers to see if we can do more this side of the next election to try and address some of these longer term changes. And I don't discount the fact that there are problems with with the cost of living and affordability. And in fact, I remember when Sajid Javid was Chancellor, there was even talk then of him reducing the contribution requirement, the opt-in rate, because of concerns about wanting to give people money in their pockets. But when you think about it, though, I thought when you look at the evidence, and I think COVID is a great example or experiment that we can point to, when there were quite acute pressures on people's pockets, people didn't tend to turn to their pension pots. There was a worry, I think, at the time that people would take money out of their pension pots, but they didn't. And I also think there's a lot more education going on, and as people, starting to be a greater realization that people need to save more. I think there's also an opportunity where if you were to increase contribution rates, you could use that as a moment in the political dialogue to get across to people how important it is for them to save, and maybe generate some awareness of what their pension savings may or may not lead to, so that you generate that buy-in. And finally, I think there are ways of doing it that can mitigate some of these cost of living issues. So for instance, we're quite supportive of an idea called auto escalation, where you opt in that any pay rise that one gets would be split between a pension contribution and your take-home salary. So you can use mechanisms like that to try and start to ratchet up people's savings rate. And another one we're pushing is automatic payroll saving, where people would save up for a rainy day, so that when the boiler goes or the car needs fixing, there's money automatically saved up in an easily accessible account. And we're working with Nest and sponsoring a pilot for this. And the idea is that when you save up a certain rainy day fund, it gets to a point where there's enough money in that short-term access fund, and the rest tips over into your pension pot for long-term savings. So I think there are all kinds of different ideas where we can look at how do we solve for long-term savings, for short-term savings, the ideas we can learn about in other countries, like Singapore has managed to use auto enrollment to help people save up for deposits, and then or they can use their pension savings to help with buying houses. There are all different kinds of things that we can do to try and mitigate some of these risks, and it doesn't have to be such a sort of a blanket approach. And so overall, that's a long way of answering your question, Steve. But I think it's at risk of becoming a really big missed opportunity, and I think it's a bit of a shame, given there's so much that needs to be addressed, and so many different ways in which those things can be addressed.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we're all disappointed that, as an industry since the 70s and 80s, we've been talking about the cost of delay. If no change is going to come in for 3, 4, 5 years, that just makes the hill harder to climb, doesn't it? We've all been in the seminars and seen the PowerPoints. So, yeah.
It's crazy. And one of the I think you see these vox pops, or you sort of interviews with people, and people look at their DC savings amount, and they go, oh, I could never live on that much per year. And then you hear the person who's interviewing saying no, that's how much, that's your entire pot. That's not just for 1 year. There's such a paucity of saving. But what makes it politically acute is that there's a paucity of awareness of the gap in the savings. So when I remember talking to somebody in 2017 about when Trump won the first election. She used to be the head of our pensions business in the US, and she said that one of the things that had generated such what's the word, a sort of lack of confidence in the system, and a kind of generated a political turn towards populism, had been so many people realizing how little they had to retire on, and being shocked and panicking, and being really worried about it, and that this had been a fuel of populism. And I think there's a risk that unless we grip it, and start to deal with this problem of not just not saving enough, but people not realizing that they're not saving enough, the political consequences will be harmful in the future.
Yeah, and that's all about member education, and especially in the younger people. We sort of had this last week with Sid, a chap called Sid Muralida, who's doing some sort of research. But we've got to get it right for the young people, and that includes education. Our dashboard, I think, also will wake people up a bit to go, sorry, that's a pension, or is that a pot? I think a big chunk of people will go, oh my God, that is actually peanuts. I need to do something about it. Or they'll start blaming their employer or blaming the provider that it's not enough and blaming the government. But yeah, there we go. Okay. Antony, thanks for your answer on that. Let's move back to some geopolitical issues. Any geopolitical issues you think are going to impact retirement for 2026? Let's just talk about the next 12 months. There's a lot going on, as you said earlier, but anything particular you want to talk about there on geopolitical issues?
I mean, I think it's still there's obviously on the investment side there's a lot going on, and as I mentioned, there's so much geopolitics at the moment. It's so difficult to navigate, and I think that's going to make things very volatile, and it makes and it's going to make investment, it's going to lead to a shift, I think, to sort of managed assets and do you remember a few minutes ago I mentioned this list of top 10 political geopolitical risks. And they also, and this was last week, and they also had what they said weren't risks or were red herrings. And one of the red herrings was tariff policy, because they thought actually that was a 2025 story. Trump's calmed down. It looks like tariff peace has been declared between the US and China. And then, of course, we wake up this morning and see that he's threatened to put a tariff on anyone who deals with Iran, and that, of course, is China. So so even the sort of these consultants, I'm sure, would say they're the best in the business. They're calling one thing one week and it's changed the next. So that volatility in investment is going to be really, really difficult for us to manage from an investment policy. And I think it will, it will make it more and more expensive and difficult to sort of deal with that. The other geopolitical risks, I think, are the desire to reduce dependence on the US, and that's sort of leading, I think, to a more and more sort of fragmentation of globalization and a desire in Europe to do things on our own, and that will of course come back into the sort of investment policy that affects pension schemes. And I think that will happen both here and in the EU. And you could see, really, I mean, I would say it comes in, there's three drivers for it in Europe. First is, in the EU anyway, there's always been a desire to be a bit more self-sufficient. There's always been a protectionist drive there from France and parts of Germany. And there's sort of like a sovereign independence or self-sufficiency. I think the latest phrase for it was strategic autonomy is what they're calling it in Brussels. When I worked in Brussels, that was very much apparent. And because the UK was a member, there was never any way you could get a consensus on it, because the UK was always under whatever government, very sort of open and liberal. Brexit has intensified that. So there's a sort of inbuilt tendency towards self-sufficiency within Europe, and that's driving that's driving policy a bit everywhere. The second thing was COVID and the interdependence on China, and I think that's in across the board, but in medicine, in all types of different things. And so there was an era of sort of deglobalization, if you will, or rewiring of globalization, I think is what BlackRock analysts called it during the Biden administration. And then in the last year or so, with what Trump did in April to Europe, and is continuing to do, it's driving a sense of we can't be dependent on these guys anymore. And all of this, I think, is driving governments towards it creates an incentive for them to direct investment towards domestic things, towards the economy. It's it's driving increases in particular types of spending, like defense spending, etc. And I think that will continue. So you have, to my mind, that's the sort of one of the biggest drivers now of geopolitical drivers that's going to impact policy. I think another one is that there is a general hollowing out of the political centre going on. We're really sort of seeing that throughout the world. So obviously you've seen it in the US. We're seeing it in France with what goes on. I think Le Pen's court case begins today, but even so, it looks like her party and Bardella are on the up in France, and and it's difficult as well. The situation looks difficult in Germany. And in the UK, we're seeing the sort of rise of reform on the right, but also a rise of the soft left within the Labour Party and within government. And even if Keir Starmer survives this year as Prime Minister, it'll be because he's had to make concessions to the left. And so you're seeing a sort of a move away from the centre in British politics. And I think that too will reflect itself in pensions policy. It'll be looking for what's more popular rather than what's right in the longer term, and it'll be looking for quick fixes in terms of investment. I think both of those things sort of paint a picture that sort of you've got the pressure to disassociate and rewire globalization and be more self-sufficient, plus a desire to be popular and reduce costs of the cost of living, and all of those things sort of point towards a much more interventionist sort of series of policies. I think on the they're driven by world events, but will show up in domestic pensions policy.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I know you're not a fund manager per se, Antony. But here's a question from Natalia. Does BlackRock plan to invest in the reconstruction of Ukraine? That could be a yes or no, or a slightly longer answer. But have you got an opinion on that?
We have we've been in touch with we've always been, we've been part actually of a number of different meetings over the years about reconstructing Ukraine, and I think if there are opportunities there that we think are in the interest of clients, and it's client money at the end of the day. If our clients want us to do that, we don't invest, our clients invest, and if we can do that on behalf of them, and if that helps with the reconstruction, then I think that is something that we're open to, or as I should say, our clients are open to.
I'm sure Natalia will be very happy with that, and yeah, it's an interesting place to be, and we pray for peace as usual in that particular sector, which Henry and I pray for every week. But there we go. Changing to the budget, by the way, Antony, we want to talk about the budget a little bit, especially things like tax allowances and salary exchange. What is your view? And then we'll come to Henry. What is your view on the budget as a BlackRock guru? And then we'll come to Henry.
So I think at a high level, it was actually surprisingly positive. I mean, our fund managers and people who are looking at the UK on as a sort of investable prospect were quite impressed that there was a clear sense of fiscal responsibility, if you want to put it that way. So I think at first we thought there aren't enough tax rises, because there had been all this talk going into the budget. It seems months ago now, right? But yeah, I guess it was a month. It feels a much further ago than it was. But there was this talk about sort of actually rising income tax rates, and then Rachel Reeves seemed to wind back from that. And I think that caused some concern that the government didn't have the political support to do what it needs to do to keep on track. Our investors, though, thought that in the end, because of the way the books had been balanced and the fact that she was prepared to freeze the income tax rates and raise taxes in that way, that showed a commitment to long-term fiscal discipline, and I think the markets reacted generally to that, and you saw a sort of reduction in yields, and I think that's boosted confidence in the UK. My only caveat to that is that they're economists and financiers, and I'm sort of watching this from a political point of view, and this sort of hollowing out of the centre that I've seen and that I think is going on, and this sort of difficulty that Keir Starmer's going to have in sort of remaining in power means that there'll be more and more pressure for him to bow to the interests of the soft left, and then we'll see then, you know, where the choices are made when it comes to cutting spending, raising taxes, or borrowing more, or paying back less. And I think those are, so to me, for me, rather than our investors, the jury is a bit more out there, and that's one thing I can. I should have said there aren't. One of the things that we're proud of in BlackRock is we don't necessarily have a fundamental BlackRock view of everything. We have individual fund managers, individual people who work for their clients and are informed by a plethora of different views. But at the end of the day, there's no monolithic BlackRock view, you know. So, you know, with that's where that nuance comes in. On the pension salary sacrifice, I mean, really disappointing, really disappointing. I mean, there's so many. The government says it wants people to invest more, and so it's giving mixed signals, because on the one hand it says you should invest, it cares about people investing more into their pensions, and then on the other hand it sort of takes away a major incentive for people to do so. And even if some of the limits mean that the impact of this isn't economically, or shouldn't, you know, isn't as wide ranging as people have said it might be, I still think it sends the wrong signal, and it's a signal that has resonance for, you know, bigger than the group of people it'll actually impact. And I think that's difficult. And I think that's I think that was a shame. And I think again, some of the tax changes that were made for returns on investment, again, they send that wrong signal.
Yeah, no, I get that. Henry, do you want to ask a question? Then we'll come to Peter Cameron Brown, who's also got an interesting question. But Henry, you start. Yeah.
You say that you don't expect people to have views on you, but people do have views on American asset managers, and we've seen quite a lot of disinvestments because of worries that you won't follow a ESG strategy which has been set out by that particular set of trustees or fiduciaries, whoever they may be. How do you feel within BlackRock about being American owned, and do you feel it holds you as a disadvantage?
Gosh, that's I think
deep,
no,
Henry. That's
I don't. Deep, you know. No, I don't think it puts us at a disadvantage. I think you know, I think there are obviously some reputational headwinds at the moment in some clients, and you know, some, for some people, and some people have some persuasions, you know, everywhere. But ultimately, you know, I think it's an advantage for us to be a large global firm. I mean, we are able to invest globally, and we're able to, you know, we're able to sort of give people anywhere the opportunity to invest anywhere else, you know, from anywhere to invest anywhere, and that sort of advantage is one that comes through being a big international firm. And in terms of being headquartered in the US, yes, we're headquartered in the US, but our constituent parts have been, you know, vocal in the UK for more than 50 years now, you know, through Barclays Capital and MLN and all of the different part. We've grown inorganically, and we've got a very, very good and very strong, UK and European pedigree. We were up in Edinburgh a few years ago celebrating the 25th anniversary of our Edinburgh office, which was the first BlackRock badged office outside of the US. And we've got 5,000 people here in the UK, and so I think culturally there's a very, very strong European and British element to the way the firm works, and no matter how vocal parts of the US administration are, we're not going to be bossed around in terms of what we invest in. We're a fiduciary for our clients, and we invest in what our clients want us to invest in, whether that be ESG products or non-ESG products, or Ukraine, or wherever. So we think that it's an advantage to be big because we can stand up to that kind of pressure, and have done so and will continue to do so.
Okay,
Thanks,
thanks.
Antony. Cool.
A useful answer, and nice to know, but that's the way you feel.
It's
Thanks,
very
Henry.
much the core of our business that we're a fiduciary and that we do what clients want us to do. And because of our breadth, we're able, and as stressed, when we investing, we don't have any conviction about that BlackRock exists or any company exists to bring about a defined change in climate, but we do think that the transition is something that is an opportunity, and climate change is a risk that has to be managed, and we're here very much to help clients do that, do those things, take advantage of the opportunities and manage the risks.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Henry. Peter, do you want to actually ask your question, because it's quite a good question, I think. Peter, do you want to unmute?
Yes, I think I'm unmuted, am I?
You are.
Yeah.
Yep,
I
definitely.
wondered whether BlackRock is looking at Aberdeen and considering whether it might seek to secure the pensions assets under its management by taking on a more active position in relation to pension funds, such as joint sponsorship of perhaps a DB fund, or indeed sponsorship or becoming a provider or one of our providers for a CDC fund. Those are the sort of...
I'm afraid I don't know. That's a bit too close. That's much closer to the commercial side of things than I am. I'm not aware of any conversations about Aberdeen.
Okay.
I mean, this is the stagecoach.
Sorry about
deal,
that,
Antony, isn't it? So, yeah, I mean, we have seen the stagecoach deal go through where Aberdeen has effectively taken over a sponsor. So, yeah, I mean, I think BlackRock may be commercially looking at that at some point, but obviously it's not necessarily in your sort of field, I guess. But good question though, I think, to raise. So thanks for that. We're getting very close to the end. Yeah, sorry, go on, Abiola.
I was going to say really quickly, Peter, to your question, perhaps we can take that offline, and I can connect with you on that, so I can get some answers for you, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine. Yes, thank you. I mean, it's just out of interest. I haven't got a particular situation in mind at the moment, but yes, thank you very much.
Okay,
perfect.
Thanks, Abiola. That's good. Yeah, we're getting to the end now, Antony. It's been a really great session. There's a couple of questions, 1 minute to go. Yeah, you briefly mentioned, Peter, about CDC. What's BlackRock's view on CDC? I know we've got a few CDC fans on here.
I think it's a great opportunity. It's for the UK, and particularly for large schemes that have many members from, I mean, for instance, a union. I think there's a positive support for it from unionized workforces, and it's a great way of managing longevity risk and a really good innovation. So it's something that we're very much leaning into and hoping to talk to people about.
Yeah, and this is my personal opinion, Antony, not Pension Playpen's opinion, but if it's good enough for the private sector, then it should be good enough for the public sector, shouldn't it? Jim?
Absolutely.
PDC, from what year does that promise give up? Is it 2029 it gives up? 2030? And then CDC for everybody in government as well. Because we can't afford it, Jim, can we? You stay-
LTPS is fairly in surplus at the moment, Steve. So
Okay, could we have some? That was a tongue-in-cheek, Jim. Tongue-in-cheek.
I know.
But Anthony, thank you for your answer there. Yeah, the only other question I have was about Torsten Bell. Have you met him? Have you spoke to him? Are you impressed? Is he destined for bigger things?
Who could not be impressed by Torsten Bell? Yeah, he's a very impressive guy. He very bright. I used to work alongside his brother, actually. He's got a twin brother in the Foreign Office. So yeah, I think a family of overachievers. He gets it. I think he understands an awful lot. And if you look at the kind of things that he wrote when he was at the Resolution Foundation, he's clearly across stuff. I think what's been a little bit less positive is the way he's been, this clause in the sword of Damocles clause, I call it, in the pension schemes bill. I wish he was less supportive of that. But in terms of the more longer term stuff, I do think he gets it and he understands that these issues need to be addressed. Whether or not he will succeed as a politician, where you have to create the political consensus in order to address some of the problems, whether or not he'll be as successful as that as he has been as a policy analyst, understanding what the problems are and what you need to do to fix them, I don't know yet, but fingers crossed. I think he's certainly got the charisma and the charm and the intellect to be able to do it.
Fantastic, brilliant. Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Anthony, fantastic. Can you believe how quickly an hour goes? Lots and lots to talk about. Fantastic response. Great view and opinion, I think, Anthony. I think everybody will join me in giving you thanks and virtual thanks and lots of digital claps, and really, really good session. Absolutely fantastic. So thank you very much indeed for that. And if anybody wants to know the response that Abiola is going to get, then email me or Henry, and we can sort of put you in touch with each other, so to speak. So, yeah, an interesting development. Anthony, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate today's session. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. So, it's a lot of talking. You'll go and have a nice cup of coffee or a cup of tea now to, yeah, sort of try and rehydrate.
I will. And thank you, and it's been such a great bunch of people. Thank you. I've been watching the pictures, and I was a bit nervous coming into it, but thank you. You made me feel very welcome, and thank you. And if you need anything from us or anyone else to take part again, there's all kinds of people in BlackRock who can help. And I forgot to plug our paper. I forgot. May I take 30 seconds just to plug that my team,
Have you got it? Have you got a PDF or a link to it? Because you can put it in the chat.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't got it. I'll send around.
Send it to me. Send it to me, and I can send it out. Yeah. If anybody wants the paper, what is the paper on, Anthony? What is it on?
So it's our sort of, we're trying to say, look, there's been so much political pressure in the last several years on pension schemes to invest in the UK. And actually, when you look at it, the issue isn't about a lack of supply of capital. The issue is really, are companies that want money, that want pension schemes to invest in them, are they doing enough to attract the investment? So we've written a whole paper on financing growth in the UK, which we've been sharing with any politicians we can get hold of, to say, look, the problem isn't what pensions invest in. The problem is, companies need to be open to investment and innovative investment, and then if they are, then pension schemes will invest in them because they're working for their members. And so we've done a paper on that, which I hope you'll take a moment to have a look
email
at.
It to me. If anybody would like that, please contact me or Henry. Yeah, we've got a few connections we can obviously send it to as well, Anthony, but really, really appreciate that. Send it to me, and yeah, we'll put it out there, as they say. So, but thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining. Hope you've enjoyed today's session, and yeah, let's pray for peace in the East, invest in Ukraine, and let's move on. And I hope everybody has a great week. And join us next time for our next coffee morning, which will be hopefully next Tuesday. But Henry and I are sorting out speakers for that. So, but thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. And today's video will be up on the website in about an hour or two. So we will put the video up as well. So Antony, thanks a lot. Abiola, thanks for supporting. And I really appreciate everybody's input. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye. Cheers, Ian. Bye.
Thank you.